Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the HSP. I got Nate here again, and we're here to talk about something kind of interesting. I didn't really know much about it. You actually showed me a podcast that dove deep into it, and you also talked about another study, which we will talk about. But I think this episode might open up a lot of eyes. It's kind of a topic that it's kind of gets pushed under the rug, and so I thought, why not talk about it? And
it's a lot of information that frankly I didn't really realize. Hence the impetus for the podcast in and of itself. Because when I first heard about the study, which we'll reference in just a second, I was so blown away by it because it completely demolished a narrative that I had for a long time that basically everyone in my life had told me. So it was very shocking to me. And then what was so interesting is that then a week later, not really in any, purely just, lucky timing, I guess you could call it, John Abramson, I can never say his last name.
Yeah, Abramson,
yeah. He went on, a number of podcasts, but specifically he went on the Jordan Harbinger show, which that's where I found him. And I happened to listen to that a week later, and he didn't specifically reference the study I was talking about, but he referenced the broader issue at hand. And the broader issue at hand is essentially the effects of big pharma on the American healthcare system, and specifically drug prices and the impact of their advertising and pushing for more and more people to be on drugs. So that's kind of the broader topic. The more specific topic, and I'll get to that right now, was actually the study. Mm-hmm. So I'll just pull this up because I want to read directly from the article that talked about it. And I heard the study in a podcast from Matt Walsh, who is a conservative political commentator, who I listen to occasionally. So he referenced this, so we'll just go to this. So a recent study is pushing back against the long-held views in medicine that depression is caused by serotonin imbalance in the brain. So that's the overall topic. Researchers from the University College London conducted an umbrella review of past meta-studies and systematic analysis of depression's relation to serotonin activity that included tens of thousands of participants. So essentially they reviewed past studies and kind of compiled all the data from those and then looked at that data. So then the specific study published this week in the Journal of Molecular Psychiatry concluded that there is no clear evidence that serotonin levels or serotonin activity is responsible for depression. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that plays a key role in governing mood, sleep, digestion, and other body functions. For years, a chemical imbalance of serotonin has been widely viewed as the culprit for depression, resulting in the widespread use of antidepressants like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, which boosts serotonin in the brain. Sorry, that was a lot, but basically that's the function of SSRIs and the basis, at least that I was told, as to why they were critical. Essentially, why SSRIs were so effective, because they actually targeted serotonin imbalances and a failure of the proper release of serotonin. So that's why they were so critical. And this study has essentially said that's just not true. So that's what's so crazy about this. I'll quick conclude here. Researchers say the review calls into question the basis for the use of antidepressants. It is always difficult to prove a negative, but I think we can safely say that after a vast amount of research conducted over several decades, there is no convincing evidence that depression is caused by serotonin abnormalities, particularly by lower levels or reduced activity of serotonin. Professor Joanna Moncrief, the study's lead author, said in a statement. So, this is, rather groundbreaking in a lot of different ways. For me personally, we'll just go to that quick. One of the reasons this is so groundbreaking is because I'm actually on an SSRI. So I'm on a medicine called Zoloft, and it essentially let's see. So when it was explained to me, at least the logic behind why I might want to take something like this, the reasoning that it had to do with brain chemical imbalances was the primary reason. So that was the primary reasoning behind what the doctors were telling me. And I believed them. That made a lot of sense to me. This idea that there was literally something biologically wrong in my brain that was causing an accelerated or abnormal amount of anxiety and depression. And for me specifically, it was more about anxiety. You'll remember this specifically. But like, we'll go back. We'll talk just personally about me for just a second. We'll get back to the research in just a second here. But basically from, I'd say, 4th grade, maybe 5th grade, I started to develop really, really bad anxiety. Like the kind where I'd have a test in 6th grade in math class and I wouldn't sleep the night before. Like just absurd. You're in 6th grade, like completely ridiculous. Or I'd miss a layup at basketball practice and I'd start crying. Like that's like, come on, man. That's hugely embarrassing. But I literally couldn't control it. That was the crazy thing. So no matter how much I told myself that it didn't matter, no matter how much I pushed and tried, I saw a therapist for a while, trying to talk it through, which I hated. I didn't want to do that. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get the level of anxiety I had to really be mitigated or go down. So that was the primary motivation for me to explore an SSRI. And I didn't start taking that until, oh man, that's a good question. I want to say maybe it was 8th grade or something like that. So here, let's get into that in just a second. We'll take a quick pause here, and I'll go deposit the dog in the other room.
All right.
All right, yeah, so basically I didn't start taking it until about 8th grade. And then from there, I started on a really low dose. Previously, I had legitimately considered stopping sports because sports was one of the primary catalysts for my anxiety. And just to clarify, I didn't really have, well, I mean, I suppose I had some depression, but I'm iffy about that, and how to actually define that and what would actually characterize that is kind of tricky. So, but there's no doubt I had anxiety. There's no question about that. I mean, I literally wouldn't eat the whole day before a basketball game.
I remember that.
I mean, I'd be a mess.
I'd be slightly nervous, but you'd be way more nervous by a factor of 10, you know?
It was absurd. And especially going into high school, like freshman and sophomore year is when I think it got the worst. Sophomore year was horrible. I had no self-confidence too, which didn't help. You're in the middle of puberty, and I was like 5'4", 100 pounds at the end of my freshman year. So I was still quite a small boy. But yeah, I was gonna quit sports. I was done. It was ridiculous. And it would be crazy. It would be the same thing for tests in school. So I'd get horrible test anxiety, just horrible. And it was ironic because like my grades were great, and I had a 4.0. There wasn't really a question about me like doing bad. I knew my stuff. It didn't matter how much I knew my stuff. I would still just be so nervous. And what made it especially frustrating was the fact that I'm a fairly logical, analytical person. So the fact that I was nervous bugged me so much because it made no logical sense. I could tell myself
you're gonna do good in the sport or the academic event.
And who gives a crap? Like it's a sophomore, soccer game. It was varsity, but yeah, with our tiny school. So it was so absurd that it almost made it worse because I knew how absurd it was. So, that was kind of where I was at. And I've been taking Zoloft basically from 8th grade till now. And I'll be a senior in college, so essentially 8 years, more or less. I had a brief break in there. We won't go into that. But I've basically been taking it since then. And I'm on a decently high dose. It's 100 milligrams. They normally don't go past 200. So, middle of the range, but anyway. So I'd like to get into my specific experience with it, but first I want to talk about one thing before, just to backtrack here real quick, because I know you might want to chime in on this, is that I did not want to take this, like, at all. I hated the idea of having to take a pill to be able to function. I hated it. So I did everything in my power to not have to take it. And in some ways, I still do everything in my power to mitigate the effects of anxiety, and for me now it's more, again, I'm so hesitant to use the word depression, but definitely more in that territory than it is anxiety. But my point is that I thought the idea of taking a pill was so abhorrent that I pursued religiously all the other things that I could do on a practical level to mitigate anxiety before I wanted to take that.
Such as?
Yes, such as daily physical exercise, which I was already doing, so that was easy. Eating essentially just healthy food, keeping your nutrition intact. It doesn't mean you have to be on some crazy diet, but not eating fast food all the time. Your body will thank you. Your brain will thank you. At that time, I hadn't gotten into going to the sauna every day after a workout and taking like a cold shower, but I've heard that there was a recent podcast that you did that touched on these topics. Yes. That was really good. So maybe if people are curious about the more scientific part of it, they can reference that. But do you want to give a brief rundown of the benefits of cold shock therapy and heat shock therapy to a certain extent?
Sure. Yeah, like the cold shock therapy, I've heard some of the biggest reasons to do it is literally to help reduce depression.
Yeah.
It boosts that norepinephrine and other neurochemicals that I'm not remembering. But either way, you feel so energized, you feel electric afterwards. It's like you feel like a new person. It's like you just took a drug. It's crazy, the boost of chemicals in your brain, the positive, happy chemicals. Like, that's a great reason to do the cold shower. I feel like afterwards, I'm like, I'm a little less worried. I'm way more chill.
Oh, yeah. No, and I fully agree. In the times that I've been able to do a cold plunge after a sauna, or just in general do a cold plunge, those effects are even magnified more. So that's kind of interesting, but keep going.
Sure. And like, I guess the heat therapy, this whole idea of stressing yourself, hot or cold, it's like this idea of like you're building up a resistance to being stressed or to being like anxious or maybe even depressed. Maybe you're putting yourself in a situation where I'm very uncomfortable.
Yep.
I'm not liking it at this moment. I don't want to be in this environment. But if you give yourself, doses of this stress that's not too much stress, because that can actually be counterproductive. But if you give yourself, I don't know, bite-sized doses of these stressors, you actually become more stress resistant, and you might not be as anxious in your day-to-day life. Who knows? But like you're saying, maybe some people might actually need a pill like that to truly help regulate. But I guess the case we're making is maybe before diving into a pill that could help regulate, trying out all of these other methods that we just laid out, like the hot, the cold therapy, the dieting, the physical exercise every day. What about even like having a deep relationship with your friends or with your family? Or there's a ton of things that might factor into why you might be anxious or depressed. And I heard all the time, like, it's because of a chemical imbalance, and then it's like, well, dang, well then you probably might need it. But that study might have suggested that for some of the people that use that chemical imbalance as the main reason to take the pill might have been misled. And that's a saddening thing, in my opinion, because it's not like our health officials are promoting sauna use, cold plunge use. Why don't you try eating foods that aren't prepackaged, eating foods that's natural or ancestral. Like what were our ancestors eating? They were eating, animals, fruit, vegetables. They weren't eating things that came in a package. And, I just feel like these things aren't talked about nearly enough. And And I guess the idea of this episode is that Big Pharma has such a huge marketing campaign. They're able to be a loud voice in the doctors' heads and in our heads about what the best solutions for curing whatever ailment you might have.
Sure. And yeah, and the things that you're pointing out and that we'll talk about more are all things that require work to a certain degree, and also are all things that aren't popularized. They're not talked about. They're simply not. At least at the level to which they should be, in my opinion. And you can imagine that all of the things. Actually, I'll take one quick step back. Let's say that you're going to go see a psychiatrist or a therapist, and you walk in and you're like, man, okay, I don't have any meaningful relationships. I don't have a significant other. I'm failing at school, or I'm not doing well in my job.
Yeah.
I don't have a stable job. My life is in chaos. I'm not fit. I don't go to the gym. I don't eat well. I'm unhappy, etc. Okay. What's the problem here? Is the problem a chemical imbalance in your brain that you need an SRSI or SSRI, or is the problem that you have a shitty life? Well, maybe we should focus on the fact that you have a crappy life first before we go to the SSRI. So this is where a lot of people get this backwards. Is, in my opinion, I think most Americans go to, oh, there is a pill to solve this problem, and don't want to actually, as a Band-Aid almost, versus the actual problem has to do with fundamental things in their life. Or at least there are things that they could proactively do first before they go to a pill. So, and yet, from what it looks like, and from the evidence and from the studies and from the statistics that we'll cite in a second, almost always those other practical, proactive things that you could do aren't the first line of defense. Almost always a doctor will jump to an explanation. Now, I know that's quite a bold statement, but the push towards a pill as a solution is strong. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. So, I'll bring back to me real quick. So, back to my own personal experience, I'm in a really unique situation because I actually did everything I possibly could to not have to take it.
For the most part, probably.
Yeah. No, I'm sure I missed some things. I'm sure I did. But what's so interesting about me right now is I still take it. And I'm doing all of those things religiously, like at a hardcore level. So it puts me in a unique position because here I am saying, like, man, we probably should be hesitant to jump to the pill as a solution. And yet I'm also taking one, but I'm also doing pretty much as I can in the other dimensions to mitigate the need for the pill and mitigate the effects of anxiety and depression. So it's a unique position. But a broader view here real quick, I'll take another step back, I suppose. This conversation, it's extremely complex. It's extremely based upon the individual, their individual circumstances, and all of those things. I'm not trashing SSRIs. I'm not saying that people don't have legitimate depression. I'm not saying people don't have legitimate anxiety. Life is hard. There are things to be concerned about. We're all conscious that we're all going to die here. So, and there's going to be plenty of suffering along the way, and we all know that. So, no, life is very hard, and I don't want to belittle people for looking for solutions to problems, such as medical solutions. Frankly, they've saved millions of lives. So there's no doubt about that. However, there is no doubt that we have a culture that has an idea of a pill as the immediate frontline solution. There's a pill for everything. You've heard that phrase before. And going back to what we were saying about like things that you can do proactively is interesting enough. Friedrich Nietzsche actually got this right. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's a whole song about that. We can start playing it in the background. But no, really. But it's dead right, and our culture is completely wrong about this. Mm-hmm. We have this idea that you need to be coddled, hence the ideas of safe spaces and microaggressions, and this idea that anything that would harm you or make you uncomfortable, you should avoid. That's completely wrong. It's completely wrong. It's a fundamental untruth. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in the Coddling the American Mind. Excellent book. They go into this at length. One of the great untruths. And what's so interesting too is random tidbit here, but once you reach 25, your brain actually starts to like shrink and basically degenerate as you get older. The only way that we know to stop that is consistent physical exercise. That's the only way that we know.
Anaerobic and aerobic.
Yeah, both. One's better than nothing, but yeah, but both. And yet, like, if we did a poll right now of, the 3 people and the cat that's listening to this podcast, my guess is almost none of them would know that. Probably. They might have an idea that, exercise is good and all those kind of things. But there's literally nothing more proactive for your future health and longevity that you could do than exercise. It's some insane percentage of a decrease in all-cause mortality. Essentially, it makes you, what we just said, it makes you live longer, makes you die less early, and it makes your life more quality. And yet, that isn't pushed to the extent that you think it would be. And, I'm probably going to get in hot water for this. But,
Perfect.
But I love hot water. But when COVID hit, we'll talk about this, When COVID hit, I almost never heard from any doctors, from our health officials, from the people that hypothetically know what's best for you, hypothetically, in a health dimension, anything about exercise, nutrition, the importance of familial relationships and maintaining them even if you're not able to see people in person, the absolute necessity of maintaining a strong sleep schedule and rhythm in terms of what you eat and what you do on a daily basis. I heard nothing about this. All I heard about was masks and social distancing.
Hand sanitizer,
etc. And it absolutely astounded me that we were missing half of the conversation, if not the majority of the conversation. You could make that argument. So I don't want to go too deep into that, but I remember reflecting upon that and thinking, what the hell is going on here? Like, why is this not being said? Why are we shutting down gyms? Why are we in California taping off playgrounds for children? And how much of that is dismissible as genuine fear and uncertainty at the beginning is an open question. I don't want to get too deep into specific policies, but on a broad level, that astounded me that conversation wasn't even had. I remember you and I both reflected upon that.
This whole idea of I feel like people are searching for that quick fix.
Yeah.
When in reality, like this T.S. Eliot, the cocktail party, we talk about it all the time, where it's like the person's like, oh, I'm struggling a lot. Oh, I don't feel very good, or I'm depressed. And then she's like, I hope it's because I'm the problem and not the world. And I feel like people, they don't think that way enough, even though it's one of the most optimistic things in the world. It's like, what would you rather have? The world is conspiring against you and you have no chance to succeed, or you're the reason why you aren't succeeding, and if you just take a few habit changes, you're going to be so much better than you were yesterday. And I think this, I don't know, that just kind of is an underlying idea about maybe a quick fix isn't really the best fix, because the hardest things in life are sometimes the most meaningful and the most rewarding, and provide the biggest return on investment. The easiest things typically don't,
if it's too good to be true, it might actually not be true. It's that classic idea. Yeah. No, I'm totally with you.
And I wanted to bring up, you mentioned this to me. It's like this categorization of mental disorders or whatever else about you explain this.
Sure. So I read a book by Christina Hoff Sommers, and I'm gonna pull it up right now. Or you're gonna pull it up right now because I'm gonna forget the title. But essentially, it was about therapizing, if I'm getting that right. But I think it was One Nation Under Therapy.
Okay.
That was the one. Yeah.
Jamie, pull that up.
Yeah. We needed Jamie. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the one. It's been like 3 to 4 years. So, yeah, that was the one. So, anyway, Christina Hoff Sommers wrote this book, One Nation Under Therapy, and she essentially goes into, so there's something called the DSM, which is a giant collection of all of the known, like, psychiatric illnesses characterized, and then it, has all their symptoms, and then how exactly you might diagnose them, et cetera, et cetera. And she went into that and did a honest look at it and essentially said, okay, well, if we were to actually apply the diagnosing standards of the DSM-5 and apply that to America, everyone would have a mental disorder. Everyone would be mentally ill. I forget what it was. I think it was like 2 or 3 mental disorders on average per person. Wow. So something absurd. Don't quote me on that. Read the book. It's way more in detail. The broader point is that, again, there's no doubt about this, we have overdiagnosed mental illness and mental disorders in our population. There's no doubt about that. And look, back to this being nuanced, that isn't to say that they don't exist. I think they definitely do. There's no doubt about that. The question is then, so even if they do, or even if you are diagnosed with one, then it always goes back to what we were just saying. Well, what do you do about it? What's the most proactive thing to do? Is it to take a drug? Maybe that would be part of the solution. That's a more reasonable approach. But almost always there's things that you can do proactively first to try to remedy the situation. And then the other issue with this idea of like mental illness and this classification of like, okay, I'm mentally ill. Is it? Oh, it's this label that seems. It's almost like a crutch. Like, I gotta be careful here. I'm trying to be careful because I'm coming at this from a personal level to a certain extent, but like, there's a danger in using that as like a classification and then having it being, essentially part of your identity. If you're on social media much, which I don't recommend, but if you are, you notice that they'll actually start to gravitate towards the idea of their mental illness as an inherent part of their identity. They'll even flaunt it as something almost to be not treasured, but to show the world as their victim status. Is, look, I'm mentally ill. And look, that's not everyone, but you do see that a lot. And it seems to be completely backwards of what you would want to have. Because for me, I don't actively go around telling people that I'm on an SSRI. That's not something I want to advertise as a crutch or something. It's not meant to be a forefront characterization of my identity. And yet that seems to be backwards. People seem to wear it almost as a badge of honor. And it seems to be missing the point to me to a large degree. And I think you've had some of this too, in your personal experience. So, okay, so enough about that to a certain degree. But yes, I've talked about my own personal experience with it. I'm going to quick touch on right now what I think about it, just real quick, for me personally. And then we can go into Big Pharma.
Sounds good.
That's fun. So I don't really advertise this, but I think it might be useful. So right now I'm on Zoloft still, and I still think that for me the benefits of taking it outweigh the cons, because I think there are cons, and I want to get into them real quick.
And might outweigh the cons of not taking it.
Yeah, of not taking it. Sorry, thank you. But specifically, one of the things that I've noticed that Zoloft does for me, and I think one of the ways that it works, is imagine that you have an emotional scale, and at 0 you're utterly depressed, and at 10 you're euphoric. I used to live in more of a, let's call it a 1 to 9 range, or 1 to 7 probably more accurately, and now I live in you smile because you know, and now I live in more of like a 3 to 5, 3 to 6 range is probably one way to put it. So it's almost like it took my extremes on both ends, that's the con, and brought them in. So I'm more centered. I don't have the same oscillation in emotions. And the advantages of that is I don't get as anxious, and I don't get as,
manic, maybe.
Yeah, manic. We'll go with that.
No.
Yeah. Thanks, dog. And I don't get as depressed, or I don't get as dark.
Mm-hmm.
But I also we joke about this, but I'm generally, I don't have a lot of moments of genuine happiness. Not really. I have lots of moments of meaningful interactions and meaning in my life, but I distinguish those two quite a bit. There's a big difference between the two. So that's one of the things that I've noticed, that my poles have shrunk. In life is a little more gray, is the other way that I put it. But for me right now, I think that's worth the cost. I think that grayness, that shrinking of the poles, is worth it for the benefits of me being able to function better day to day. And I think that equation will change. I hope it does, frankly, because I'd like to eventually get off of it. But that's my current calculation, while I'm also doing all of the proactive other things that I possibly can do to improve my mental state in general, which is deeply connected to your physical state, hence what we've talked about.
Yeah.
So that's just me on a personal level. But I want to get into Big Pharma.
Sure. Yeah.
So we talked about that study at the beginning, which was the, essentially that the basis, one of the fundamental bases for SSRIs in people, this idea of a chemical imbalance in serotonin, is false. It's not true. There's no evidence to support it. That's rather groundbreaking. And you may wonder, why precisely are we knowing that now, 20 to 25 years later, after the development of SSRIs? You would think that, something like that, that's a common mantra, that doctors think, that everyone thinks, that we've all been told is true, would have been presented with biological data and markers to back it up in the initial, let's say, push/invention of SSRIs. Because hypothetically, they were designed to solve that biological distinguishable problem. But here we are 25 years later, 20 years later, saying that problem never existed to begin with. So then you have to ask the question is, well, how did that happen? And that is where our man, John Abramson, comes in. So you want to quick talk about him for a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I'll read his bio, honestly.
Yeah.
He has been on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School for 25 years, where he teaches healthcare policy. He also served as a family physician for 22 years. He was named top doctor 6 times in local, state, and national surveys. He also wrote a few books. The one book that we're covering mainly in this episode, or I guess the statistics that we get come from this book, which is called Sickening: How Big Pharma Broke American Healthcare and How Can We Repair It? And he, like you said, he was on that Jordan Harbinger show. I'm going to throw that right in the description because I feel like that he paints such a great picture. It's only an hour and 20 minutes. It's a quick listen, and you'll get a lot of info. But I think one of the stats that they opened with, and I guess this is all kind of about, this is a good summary in my opinion. Despite spending in excess of $1.6 trillion on healthcare per year compared to other wealthy countries, the amount of time that Americans live in good health ranks a lowly 68th in the world. And that's an interesting statistic. I think it said something like we spend $4 trillion a year on drugs, pharmaceutical drugs.
Well, healthcare.
Okay,
is
healthcare.
probably
Okay,
the broader
Yep.
way of putting it, but continue.
And all of the other countries that are wealthy spend not even 2.5 trillion. So it's we're
in
spending
comparison.
Yeah.
In comparison. I mean, obviously the numbers are different, but yeah.
But it doesn't seem as if America is really that healthy.
No, we're not.
39% of adults are classified as obese, which is not a good sign, and that's just so I'm trying to think where next.
Well, that just kind of opens the broad problem. Let's say we're spending a ton of money and we're getting no good returns for it. So then the question is why? Why might that be the case? And now we get into the way that the pharmaceutical industry has essentially corrupted our healthcare system, or as he put it, broke American healthcare.
Or almost used the system that they've been given, like the free market system, to, with not that much regulation, to, grow and become the behemoths that they are today, almost.
Sure. So, I'm a fairly libertarian, laissez-faire minded person, primarily because all of the evidence ever in the history of the world points to the idea that free markets have been the absolute critical way that we've managed to, be wealthy and live with electricity and all the miracles that surround us actively every day. So that's why I'm a big fan of it, because, people don't starve when you have capitalism and free markets. However, this is one of those areas where I'm like, man, there is no doubt that some kind of oversight, regulation,
some guardrails,
something needs to be done. And this is where the comparison between us, the United States, and New Zealand is useful. So let's quick talk about this. So essentially, there's only 2 countries in the world that are allowed to advertise for pharmaceutical drugs. And this I had no idea about this until I listened to the podcast. That was really fascinating. And it's us and New Zealand. But this is the key difference between us and New Zealand and then us and a lot of other countries that, in the pharmaceutical world, is in the United States, we essentially have no oversight over the creation and marketing of new drugs. So there's very little regulation. So Exhibit A, let's just talk about this because this will explain it pretty much perfectly. Let's go to Humira. So basically, so Humira was the most advertised drug in the world, in the United States specifically, but in the world, for a long period of time. And it cost about $72,000 per year, which, is a lot of money. Forgive me, do you happen to remember what it treats technically? Was it inflammation?
It's anti-inflammatory.
Yeah. So it's an anti-inflammatory, and there's a bunch of uses, right? So, but the point is it's heavily marketed. Now, here's something interesting. Methotrexate is an older version of Humira, essentially. It does the exact same thing. And when you actually compare them one to the other, you can actually make an argument that methotrexate is slightly better. Now, it's not statistically significantly better, meaning that the differences
are marginal.
Yeah, marginal enough that error could account for them. But regardless, we know at least they're even in their effectiveness. So then you might ask the question as well, how much does methotrexate cost? Well, it turns out it only costs $480 versus Humira costs $72,000. So you may ask the question, why the hell are we not using methotrexate? And that is because of the absolute failure of of the American healthcare system to regulate and have some kind of an oversight board to oversee what new drugs are allowed to be marketed, in what way, and whether or not they're even better than previous drugs. So this is the key difference, because in New Zealand, that's not the case. In New Zealand, they have an active pharmaceutical oversight. I'll let you just read the rest.
Sure, yeah. It's something called Health Technology Assessment.
Yep.
And this is where a government entity actually assesses all the data that they can get. It's not maybe perfect, the data, but they compare the old drugs and the new drugs, and they compare it for effectiveness and efficiency, like economic efficiency, and it's it's someone that's more independent. That's not a person who works at Pfizer who's creating the study.
Yeah.
It's someone who doesn't, and they're just trying to be as unbiased as possible. New Zealand spends the lowest drug spending per capita, so the lowest drug spending per person in New Zealand, whereas United States is the highest drug spending per capita. So it's like these are almost not comparable. We're the two countries that advertise, but the way in which we advertise is completely different, because New Zealand, there's so many guardrails. Like, innovating and trying to find a new drug that's marginally better is not useful in New Zealand to spend all that money on research and marketing.
You wouldn't want to because it would get shut down. Humira wouldn't exist.
No, they'd be using Methotrexate,
Yeah.
whatever it's called. And, yeah, and saving the country money, saving the citizens' money, but guess what? The pharmaceutical companies aren't nearly as rich as the ones in the United States because they have those guardrails put in place. And I guess that this John Abramson, he's talking about, like, people sometimes think of, like, Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies as companies that are truly trying to help. And maybe they are, but most businesses, their underlying goal is profit in general. Increase, their growth, increase the amount of employees, increase their bottom line.
But real quick, but specifically publicly traded corporations.
Sure.
So that's the big difference. Small private entities, small businesses, nonprofits. There's different classes here. But publicly traded companies, they're fundamentally beholden to their shareholders.
Yes.
So like that is their job. So that's how the system works. So then without proper regulation and oversight, I'll put on my slightly less libertarian hat. You end up with these problems. So you were on a roll, but yeah, that's how it works.
And he's talking about how, like, in biotechnology, innovation, sometimes you might think innovation means to truly come up with a groundbreaking supplement or drug that truly is so much better than the previous one. And that might happen occasionally.
Sure.
But typically when we're talking about innovation when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, innovation means that currently used products will be replaced by more expensive and profitable products.
Yep. That is the
possible.
definition in this case. Yep.
And it's just interesting to hear. And he's not saying that the doctors are the people that are behind this. They actually are kind of ignorant to some of this because I guess we should get into why.
Yeah, let's quick get into that. Right before we do, I want to strongman my boy capitalism.
Yes.
Because it does happen to be the case. Yes, in this case, and especially for pharmaceutical companies, this is the version of innovation that they're primarily pursuing. However, that doesn't mean that occasionally they don't actually come up with something truly groundbreaking. So it happens to be the case that the U.S. is like, we make all the drugs. Anything new pretty much is made here. It turns out that if you want to live from a serious cancer or you want like a special surgery done, we have the best doctors in the world and we have the best cancer survival rates in the world. So we have the best specialists in the world, etc. So it's not, and the reason we have that is because if you're actually the best, you'll actually get paid to be the best. So in Canada, in places with socialized medicine, there's a cap on what you'll get paid. The government decides that. They say you're going to only get paid this amount. In a free market system, if you're really good, you're going to get paid more. So that's the blessing and the curse here. I mean, it's the blessing of capitalism is we actually do make all the crap. But if it's not properly regulated, then a lot of the new crap is just pork. It's not worth it. It's not good. It's not helpful. It's not efficient because of the failure of the system here in terms of to properly regulate it. Now we'll go right back. Well, how has this happened? How have we gotten ourselves into this situation? And it has to do with peer reviewing and the data. So let's get into that. I got the specific wording
perfect
right here just because this is kind of an important point. So this is what's kind of crazy. And I knew this because I had actually listened to a podcast in a similar department about a year ago. So I did know this, but it got just re-hammered into me throughout this dive that I've done. So this is absolutely crazy. So the majority of studies done on new drugs are entirely funded by the pharmaceutical companies. Well, they are making them, after all, right? Well, they do have to actually go through trials. They do have to actually do this. That's when they collect the data. So that's when they actually see, well, is this better than a placebo? Is this better than, is this actually producing a positive effect, hypothetically, right? What are the side effects, et cetera, what are the risks, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is what's crazy, is even though peer review ensures that these reports are accurate, let me get this statement right, correct. It's from this article. So there's this idea that, nonetheless, thorough peer review ensures that these reports are accurate, right? It's wrong. Unbeknownst to almost all doctors, peer reviewers are not granted access to the underlying data that serves as the basis for the reported findings. The drug companies own that data because they funded the various studies and keep it confidential as, quote, corporate property. Reviewers must rely on a brief data summaries included in the submitted manuscripts from the pharmaceutical companies, and peer reviewers at even the most prestigious medical journals cannot possibly attest to the accuracy and completeness of the articles they review. So in summary, they don't get the data. The peer reviewers, they don't actually get access to the data.
Neither do the doctors.
So literally, this is what happens. The pharmaceutical companies fund the study on the new drug that they really want to market because they can make a lot of money off of it. They then send a summarized version to the peer reviewers, to these journals, to these scientific journals, where they literally get to write their own conclusions, their own summaries, have to provide none of the underlying data, just summaries of the data. The peer reviewers, that's all they have access to, is these summaries written by the very people that are incentivized to want to make that drug as optimistically viewed as possible. I mean, obvious incentive problem here. And then these peer reviewers see this, and I mean, they don't have a nuanced look at it because they don't have the data. This is what people don't understand. So what happens then is these drugs get approved by the peer reviewers, and doctors then go to the medical journals that just approved them. They just said, yep, this is effective. Yep, this passes, etc. It gets FDA clearance, etc., etc. These doctors go look at that. They say, oh, look, this is a new drug. This one's better than the previous one. Yep. Oh, I know it costs a lot, but it's worth it because it's the best we have. This is one we're going to use right now because the medical journal told us that that's the best one. Doctors don't have time to go look at the underlying data. They probably can't even get access to it. And on top of that, they're not trained to do that kind of research. Hypothetically, that's the job of the peer reviewers. Well, if the peer reviewers don't have access to the underlying data, they're basically useless. So that's where you end up in a situation where you can have a drug like Humira that's 150 times more expensive than Methotrexate, and yet is the best-selling drug on the planet. So this is the absolute rot of this critical fact that most people have no idea exists. We don't get access to the data. The pharmaceutical companies own that data. So, I can't say that enough. And that is, to a large extent, at the core of the problem in American healthcare. That there's no oversight. There's no one saying, like in New Zealand, look, this drug, statistically, is not any more effective than this other one. And then once these new drugs, like Humira, get under U.S. patent, they're insanely profitable.
And now they have enough money to lobby for their agenda and for the new
Exactly.
drugs. And, you know, it's so interesting. There's a few examples that they bring up in the podcast about, like mess-ups that pharmaceutical companies, you know, they pushed out drugs that really were not helpful and were actually counterproductive to a lot of people. And the first one is Bextra, which is another anti-inflammatory, and it actually, there were 8,000 plaintiffs who allegedly had cardiovascular disease from Bextra.
Yep.
And Pfizer actually had to pay like $2.3 billion to settle the case, and this was back in like 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the point here is, you know, 8,000 people had cardiovascular disease from, it was found from Bextra. And
which they probably eventually died from, by the way.
Possibly, yeah.
Continue.
And I guess the point is, Pfizer still today, you know, creates drugs, and it doesn't seem like they I don't know if you guys see how many billions of dollars they make each year. 2.3 billion. It's
a
slightly
slap on the wrist.
It is. No one went to jail.
No.
Like, even though people might have realized, like, maybe this isn't the safest. It's like they're not incentivized to be incredibly careful with their study.
Oh, of course not. I mean, Pfizer's the savior of the year. I mean, Pfizer is the savior. They're making these COVID vaccines, and everyone suddenly is now a giant fan of Pfizer. Which isn't that convenient. Let's quick talk about Vioxx, and then I want to go back to that. So, you talk about it.
All right.
More about it.
Yeah, Vioxx. This was like, I think, the worst catastrophe in pharmaceutical world, and they killed a range between 40,000 and 60,000 Americans were actually killed from Vioxx.
This is the crazy thing. This was over the course of years.
I think this was 2003 or 4.
I don't recall, but
keep going.
Like it wasn't like it was released and then very quickly, oh my word, people are dying from it. We got to be done here. No, it took 40 to 60,000 Americans dying from this for finally to go to court. And again, well, look who's still around. Merck and company's still around. They're doing great. They're making the most money they've ever made off of COVID-related drugs. So these are some of these crazy stories of something that never should have passed peer review. It never should have made it to market. But the only reason it could is because, again, the peer reviewers don't have access to the underlying data. That's the crazy thing here. So to bring quick back to COVID, I'm going to go right back into my hot water that I was enjoying. So you can imagine a scenario after knowing all of these things. Let's say that you know all these things. You know how new drugs are made. You know the profit incentive, etc. And then let's say that you know that the most profitable years for pharmaceutical companies happened post-COVID with the introduction of the COVID vaccine. Let's say that you knew that they were guaranteed the most money they ever could have dreamed from the federal government. Then let's say that you also knew that the pharmaceutical companies had no liability for the vaccines. Let me make that very clear. They are not liable for the effects of the vaccines, the pharmaceutical companies. The federal government made that very clear. It was part of the deal, essentially. So they're not liable for them. They're the most profitable items that they've ever produced. And you can imagine a situation where you might be thinking, maybe we should be a little bit more hesitant about believing them and the narrative surrounding all of this before jumping into that with open arms. And given everything that we just said, given the fact that we don't have access, the peer reviewers don't have access to the underlying data. We don't actually know. They're not liable for them. That should be a giant red flag. Then you have to ask the question, well, we have been told for years that we can't even ask those questions. So that's where I get very, very skeptical of what's going on here. And this is coming from someone that is about as pro-vaccine as they come. I'm a big fan of vaccines. In fact, I think they're one of the miracles of the world. So I rather like them. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions. That doesn't mean that you can't say, well, for some people it might not make sense. Or it might not make sense to take a vaccine. And one quick more point, I don't want to get bogged down in this, but one quick more point. You also can imagine a scenario where natural immunity, people that have actually had COVID, that are immune to COVID, that has been shown to be more effective than a vaccine in terms of preventing you from both contracting COVID and also having any kind of serious symptoms after getting it. You would think that people that had natural immunity would be tested for it and then told not to get a vaccine. Or at least that would be a discussion. Or at least, not even the not get a vaccine, but that given the fact that the effectiveness of natural immunity is inarguably higher than the effectiveness of a vaccine, you would think that, I don't know, at our airports, in every major country in terms of travel and the restrictions imposed on the people that weren't vaccinated, you would think that natural immunity would allow you the same rights, the same access, the same level of freedom as people that were vaccinated. And yet, not only was that shunned, you weren't even allowed to talk about it. So, knowing all of these things, I'm not going to come to any magical conclusion here because it's very complicated. But you should at least take a second to think about this all and be more skeptical of what exactly you're being told and the narrative that you're being told. And that's kind of where I'm at with that specifically. And I think you're probably in a similar place. You got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I actually didn't get the COVID vaccine, but just because I did the analysis of my age, like I'm 20,
Yep.
It reminds me of something like the flu, something we might have to live with, and I don't know if it was the best decision or not. Who knows? But I don't know if I have that much more to say. But I do know that in this podcast, John Abramson was saying that because of all the mutations that are occurring in other countries specifically, he was saying, this was his case, that the pharmaceutical companies that are creating these vaccines are mainly wanting to give them to the rich countries that will pay top dollar for these vaccines. Whereas low-income countries might not even have access to these vaccines and might allow the vaccine to mutate into different mutations.
The virus.
The virus.
Yep.
There we go. Into different mutations. And then these mutations might spread to the rich companies or to the rich countries, and then guess what? Now Pfizer and J&J will now provide booster shots and new vaccines that help with the new
strain of COVID,
because they aren't actually giving out their vaccine to as many people as possible. Mainly to the people who will pay top dollar. And it's interesting things that are being brought up that I only heard of like a week ago. So I don't know if I have a whole opinion. I don't have the data on that, but it's interesting to hear. And in my opinion, I feel like COVID is going to be like the flu. We're going to have to keep dealing with it for, I don't know, maybe our whole lives. And
almost certainly. I mean, it's difficult to make the case that you won't, and that it will become a natural part of the many cold viruses and flu viruses that exist.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to have to each 6 months or each year continuously get boosted by something that they aren't liable for, that the data can't always be shown. There's just skepticism that occurs here for me, and that's maybe it's a good, helps cement my case on why I might not want to get it, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and real quick on that, you can imagine a scenario where there's again a cost benefit curve to taking the vaccine or not taking the vaccine. So you either deal with the costs of potentially, having a worse version of COVID because it turns out that the vaccine doesn't prevent you from getting COVID. Whoop-de-doo, who would have guessed? We were lied to about that for about a year. So it turns out that it doesn't prevent you from getting COVID. So you either deal with the costs of getting COVID, or you deal with the potential costs and side effects of a vaccine. And then you have to factor in, okay, well, what are my actual risk levels? What is the effectiveness of the vaccine from preventing me from getting long-term side effects of COVID, from helping me to deal with the virus better, from potentially saving my life, because there's a lot of evidence to support that the vaccine has a decently marketed effect on preventing you from dying from COVID. So you have to analyze all those things, and then you have to analyze based upon your age, pre-existing conditions, etc. And then you have to say, okay, well, where exactly do I end up on that cost-benefit curve? Well, for me personally, I think that number is right around the 20 range. I think the young adult, 18 to 21-ish, has an open question about the pros and cons of a vaccine versus the pros and cons of just allowing themselves to get the virus. or dealing with the consequences of not getting the vaccine, rather. Because, you can, again, imagine a scenario where if you're 80, that cost benefit is no question. Obviously, getting the vaccine is going to make sense, almost certainly. When you're 40, well, you can ask that question again. I still think that the underlying data supports, generally speaking, that getting the vaccine produces that there's less cost and risk associated with that. Well, then when you get down to 20, and then that's where it gets very interesting, because I don't think that you can make a solid case that every 20-year-old needs to get vaccinated. I really don't. I don't think the data supports that at all, especially given what we know about the fact that the vaccine doesn't prevent you from getting COVID, and it doesn't prevent you from transmitting the virus. So that's a very interesting question where you get to that 18 range. Now, what's less uncertain is for children.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to stamp my flag in the ground in this point, because I can't believe it's happened. Well, I can believe, but I'm actually appalled by it. It's absolutely ridiculous that this is happening. But I mean, the federal government, these companies, etc., are actively marketing COVID vaccines for babies, for children, for people that are not affected basically at all by this virus. Basically at all. More kids died from drowning last year than from COVID. More kids died from the flu last year than COVID. I can go on and on. And you have to, again, weighing the things that we know, weighing all the incentive structures of the pharmaceutical company, weighing the fact that they're not actually liable for the long-term consequences that we don't know, fundamentally, of these vaccines.
The data is still coming in.
Yeah, we don't know. Weighing all those things, knowing those cost-benefit curves, knowing that children are, thank God, by and large, not affected by this virus, you have to ask the question, should I be injecting my 6-month-old with this vaccine? Is that really wise? Do I trust the people that are telling me to do that, given everything I know? And to me, that's basically a no-brainer. You shouldn't trust them. And it's crazy to watch that happening right now. And more specifically, it was crazy during the pandemic to see, kindergartners not allowed to go to school, and even when they were, they had to wear masks. And if you know anything about children's developmental psychology and the absolute critical nature of specific developmental periods in young children in terms of social interactions that they have to have, or they will be permanently impaired in their social ability for the rest of their life. If you know those statistics, which I do, you realize that we have screwed, to a certain extent, tens of millions of children in ways that we will not see the consequences of to their full extent for decades. So there's my flag in the ground. I wanted to make that statement because it's appalling to me. It's appalling what we did to kids. What the government, what the idiotic
isolation on a computer.
Oh, I mean they're just screwed. And then we can get into some statistics on how many of them exactly are on SSRIs, shall we? So if we're going to look at all psychiatric drugs, age group 0 to 17, about 6 million children, 0 to 17, are on these drugs. And to put that in perspective, we could do this age breakdown real quick. 0 to 1 years, 85,000, 2 to 3, 140,000, and then as you get up to 6 to 12, it's about 2.5 million, and then 13 to 17 is about 3.2 million. And one of the important facts here is, this is accelerating. We're adding millions of children to these drugs every year. And what also we need to take into account here is that we live in the safest, freest, most prosperous country in the history of the world. So, intuitively, you wouldn't think that, given those facts, you would have an accelerated rate of children taking these drugs.
Or have the highest drug spending per capita
Yeah.
either.
Exactly. And then again, going back to what we've discussed previously, knowing what we know about pharmaceutical companies, knowing what we know about the actual knowledge that doctors have on these things, knowing what we know about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Knowing these things, you have to ask the question, is this the best policy? Is this a good thing? Is this wise? The number of children that we have on these brain-altering, mood-altering chemicals, drugs in their brain. You at least have to ask that question. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's particularly disturbing. And of course, there's a million things you can go into that. ADHD medication, the fact that recess is disappearing from schools overall, if you look at trends.
Specifically public schools.
Yeah, specifically public schools. Obviously, you go back to the fact that, for essentially 2 years, kids weren't allowed to have almost any social interaction, at least in a school environment. And most parents certainly didn't let them for at least a year. So, because that's what our experts told us. The experts. Oh, and here's another tidbit, just because I'm on a roll. Do you know who the highest paid government official is in the United States?
No.
It'd be Anthony Fauci.
That's what I was going to guess. But...
Yeah. And this isn't even a bone with our man Anthony Fauci. I'm not trying to pick a fight with him right now, but that's an interesting fact that we could just add as a nice little cherry on top of our nice little collection of facts we have going on here.
And then Joe Rogan gets insanely criticized for suggesting that ivermectin,
this is another fun one. Yep.
That won the Nobel Peace Prize.
The creator.
Yeah, the creator of ivermectin won the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's been around for like 40 plus years.
Yep.
It's treated millions of people. The data is longitudinal and effective. The data shows that it's longitudinal and effective. But now you try to search to find that, that's something that, got banned from YouTube. Joe Rogan is now classified as a crazy conspiracist because he mentioned ivermectin as a useful way to defend against the vaccine. What about vitamin?
No, against the virus.
I'm
Keep mixing those up. It's okay.
But or just like vitamin D, getting outside in the sun, or any of those other pillars we were talking about before. It's just I think the whole lesson of this podcast is you have the ability to make many steps to decrease your risk of all kinds of different diseases.
Yep.
And if you take on that responsibility, I feel like the results you'll see are so much greater than the results of you sitting back and waiting for the experts and the masters to tell you what to do and to provide for you. I just don't think you're going to get the same kind of result as taking daily action to change your habits and, utilize the methods we have to live longer, healthier lives.
Yeah, and we actually know you won't, because all the things that we just mentioned basically aren't actively pushed by our top health authorities. They're not, which should be a giant red flag. Why aren't they talking about vitamin D and the fact that a giant percentage of the U.S. population is chronically deficient in vitamin D, which is one of the key statistical relevant facts regarding people that suffered more from COVID and died from COVID. In simpler terms, basically, they've done these studies. The number of the people that either had severe reactions to COVID or died from COVID were much, much more likely to be deficient in vitamin D. Now, there's some correlation there, but we actually do know causation in terms of the biological reasons that you actually have to have vitamin D in sufficient amounts in your system. And, that can be solved by a simple pill every day.
And some sunlight.
But of course, there's not really any money in that. So why would you say that? And that's the exact same situation with ivermectin. It's been around so long. It's not under patent. It's dirt cheap. So why exactly would you promote a drug in the U.S. that's dirt cheap? That's not under patent because there's no money to be made in it. So there's so much corruption. There's so much money involved. You can't take everything on face value. I'm not saying they can't get stuff right. The government yeah, Fauci's got lots of stuff right.
Mm-hmm.
That I think the CDC has been one of the bastions for global health and development throughout its years, throughout the decades it's been around. It's done incredible things. But that doesn't mean that they can't get things wrong. It doesn't mean that they can mislead you. They can, and they have. So I guess that's part of the message here too. But then because I'm running out of brain and throat, what you said in terms of kind of the parting message here for me and for you and for everyone, again, the three people in the cat that's listening to this, what can you do to actively improve your health, your life, and your mental health specifically? And the things that we outlined are things that we can do. And I guess that's a whole nother podcast to a certain extent, but asking that question in a genuine way is the key to start that process. So, and that's been, at least for me on a personal level, asking that question and trying to activate upon the things that I've discovered and realized has been critical. It's been transformative for my life. So
certainly, yeah, you'd be surprised what some small actions can truly do to your health.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah. No, we'll end with that. So, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Nietzsche.
There we go.
Heck yeah. Hormesis. Welcome to the Harley Sealbinder Podcast, the podcast where important topics are covered and deep questions are asked. Come join me as I try to update my worldview and impact people positively while doing so. I really hope you enjoyed this episode.